So welcome to this morning's Muscle Matters online seminar on congenital muscular dystrophy. The MDUK Muscle Matter seminars have become a regular feature in MDUK's calendar, and they won't replace, but they'll run alongside our live events when we can host them again. And we are hoping to host some live events in the autumn of this year. So our helpline remains open to anyone affected by muscle wasting conditions, and do please contact us if you have any questions or you're in need of support. We can help with information and can either support you directly or point you in the direction to point you where you can get support from. The number and email address are not on your screens. I was about to say they are on your screens, but you can call us on 0800 652 6352, or you can email us at info@musculardystrophyuk.org, and all those details are on our website, and you should have received them in your Zoom link as well. So we are grateful to be joined by an expert panel covering a broad range of expertise on congenital muscular dystrophy. We're also very grateful for the support of our sponsors. So this morning, we're splitting the session into two parts. And first of all, we'll begin looking at research before exploring living with and managing the condition. Before we begin, just a note on how you can ask questions or make comments throughout the session. So we have some advanced questions and we will be seeking to cover these later. We'd also like to incorporate some live input. To do this, we'll be using the Q&A function. So please type your questions or comments and we'll feed them into the discussion. To help us manage the technical side of the event, we won't be calling on questionnaires to ask for their questions directly. Any questions we don't manage to cover or don't know the answer to, we'll seek to answer through our website afterwards. And finally, just a reminder, we are recording this session and it will be made available over the next week or so. So to start this morning off, I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Kate Adcock, who will introduce our research speakers and then chair that part of the session this morning. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Neera, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce two members of a fantastic panel this morning. Firstly, thanks to the power of Zoom, we're joined by Dr. Gisèle Bonne from Paris, she's the Director of Research at ANSEM and leads a team of 30 researchers working on conditions such as Emery-Dreifuss and other laminopathies, Collagen 6 related myopathies and central nuclear myopathy. Gisèle has been at ANSEM since 1996, where she studied the genetics and pathophysiology of Emery-Dreifuss muscular dystrophy, and has been instrumental in identifying genes responsible for neuromuscular conditions such as LMNA congenital muscular dystrophy. Joining Dr. Bonne on the panel is Dr. Anna Sarkozy, who is the consultant paediatric neurologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. Anna studied medicine in Rome and has worked at the Newcastle Muscle Centre for several years. In 2014, she joined the Dubowitz Neuromuscular Centre at Great Ormond Street, where she currently works as consultant in neuromuscular diseases. Anna's research interests are in the identification of new genes that cause muscle wasting conditions, clinical characterizations of rare neuromuscular phenotypes, and natural history of diseases, in particular congenital myopathies and muscular dystrophies. Firstly, we'll hear from Dr. Bonne, who will talk about her research on congenital muscular dystrophies and work that has been funded by MDUK, and she'll be followed by Dr. Sarkozy, who will be presenting on more patient-facing research, including natural history studies for neuromuscular disorders. And this will be followed by a Q&A session. So do please find on your screen, usually at the bottom, the Q&A function if you have some questions, and we'll be answering those in the discussion. So first of all, Gisèle, I'd love to hand over to you and hear what you have to tell us this morning. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kate, for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today, and I hope you can see my screen now. So,
yes, I can.
It's a great pleasure to share my work today with you. and I will highlight what we are currently doing on research side from LMNA related congenital muscular dystrophy, and also on other type of straightened muscle laminopathies, and I will explain you in a moment what all are there. So I'm working at the Center of Research in Myology in Paris, and these are the members of my team who work. Do you see? No, you may not see my. You see my pointer now? So these are the name of my colleagues working with me on that topic. So lamin AC, the LMNA gene, it's a gene that helps to produce protein in the body, and its name is called LMNA, and the product out of this gene is lamin A and lamin C, which is this kind of protein that form some structure in the nucleus of the cells. And the LMNA related congenital muscular dystrophy are due to mutation and variation in these genes that impact the correct production of those products, lamin A and C. So what are lamin A and C? These are so the product of the LMNA gene, and they form proteins. So these proteins are localized inside the nucleus of every of our cells, and is localized here. So here you have a nucleus of a cell, the nucleus of the cell here, sorry, and on the scheme you can see the envelope of the nucleus, and inside you have the DNA, the genome, that contain all the genes of our body, and here it's a membrane around to protect this genome. And lamin A and C form a structure that protect at the inner side of the nuclear envelope. If we look at the muscle, this is an electronic microscopy picture of a piece of muscles, and we cut it and look at how it look like the muscles. So here it's how look like a muscle, and the dark line outside at the periphery of the nuclei is here the lamin AC. So it's just to show you where is the product that are defective in our cells, in all our body, in all the muscle cells of our body. So mutation in these LMNA genes have been associated not only with congenital muscular dystrophy, but to a very wide range of other muscle disease, of other disorder that affect the peripheral nerve, the adipose tissue, or associated with premature aging. But what is our interest in my team is all the disease linked to skeletal and cardiac muscles called striated muscle. And there is different subgroup of disease. So there is 3 groups of disease, as Kate said in the introduction. We initially identified hemorrhoid-Dreyfus muscular dystrophy. There is limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and we report in 2008 with Professor Quijano Roy the congenital form linked to this defect. And I will not enter into the detail, but the difference between these different muscular dystrophy is the age at onset. You see, early childhood or adulthood, and the severity of the muscle symptoms. But they all share the same cardiac disease that usually arise a bit later, and I will come into detail in a minute. So I can schematically present these 4 different diseases: the congenital form, the hemorrhagic, the limb girdle muscular dystrophy, or the cardiac disease that can appear alone without any skeletal muscles. And here is the age at onset of skeletal symptoms. You can see it's very variable. And here on top, I had the age at onset of the cardiac disease. So again, the cardiac disease is rather variable also. And it's really important to understand at what age both skeletal and heart symptoms appear to understand all the mechanisms that make the progression of the disease, to be able to propose adapted therapy to prevent the progression of the disease. So here, as you understand, this gene has multiple mutation, and we focus, it's important to know which mutation give rise to congenital form with an onset before 2 years of age. And on this scheme, which is a bit tiny, you see the drawing of the two proteins, the two molecules, and you have here the mutation map, that is the number of cases with a specific mutation, and here is the number of cases reported worldwide. And you see that there is a few positions where there is specific mutations that are found in different patients, and this is a more frequent one, but you can have mutation all along the product, the lamine A and the lamine C. And it's important to understand why and the variety of the different mutation. And we try to understand this. And to do so, we make a natural history study, and Dr. Sarkozy will tell you a bit more about how it works. That is, we gathered all the knowledge of the mutations of the patients through their physician, and we made this at international level to collect all the knowledge on clinical data of patients carrying this mutation. And we were able to identify 151 cases carrying lamine mutations with an onset before 2 years of age. Out of them, it happens that 49 of them never walk, but 101 achieved walking by 1 year of age, roughly. And among those, however, 85 lost ambulation with a mean age of loss of ambulation around 7 years of age. And we were able to identify that, for example, the most frequent mutation, this arginine 249 tryptophan mutation, has a more severe perspective than other type of mutation. It is important to know by looking at all the clinical detail of patients and how they evolve, to have a kind of prospective evolution and prognostic. We also looked at age at onset with difficulty of respiratory impact, and you see it's rather early. The first time of any cardiac defect, also around 10 years of age, and all this analysis of this large number of patients at the international level allowed us to identify that the walking status and some specific mutation define an age range where most of the clinical progression occur in this condition between 5 and 50 years of age. And it's really important when we will be close to propose any trial to have a better understanding of how progress every case depending on every mutation. Also importantly, we had identified in this study some patients that do not behave as a majority. That is, here it's a kind of complex drawing, but the dots represent the individual cases and the age at which they have some defect. And you see that on top in the circle, are a few patients where they have defect much later. And it's also very important to understand why with the same mutation, some patients develop later onset compared to others who develop early onset. And this is one of the, this is the objective of the project that we have been funded by MDUK to understand and to identify some modifiers, genes and variant or mutations in addition to lamin gene defect, to understand why double defect could potentially modulate the severity of the disease. And I will go very fast because I see the timing is flying, but we have two main aims. One is to look at the variability of severity within a same family. Here we have the chance to have a very large family in which we have patients with early onset of muscular symptoms or late onset with muscular symptoms, or even only cardiac disease with no muscle symptoms. And we have done whole genome sequencing of all these affected patients. And with that, we are currently investigating two candidate modifier genes that could explain why in some patients there is only cardiac disease, whereas in others they have early onset muscle symptoms plus cardiac disease. The other axis of this grant is to look at the interfamilial variability. That is, we take advantage of the international cohort and try to understand for those who carry the same mutation but have either early onset or late onset. And for that, we focus our attention on only two mutations more frequent, this arginine 453 and this glutamine 358. And we are collecting biopsies, muscle biopsy or skin biopsy from patients in order to derive cells in culture from this patient material and explore further the product produced by the lamin genes and associated partner. And these are the different techniques that are currently ongoing to look what are the modifications we can identify that could explain the variability of severity in these patients. I will not say more than that, just to acknowledge my team and essentially Louise Benaroche, who has been paid by the grant with MDUK for working on this, trying to understand the variability, because knowing why patients can be more severe or less severe is really important to adapt any therapy we are currently designing in parallel to this work. Thank you for your attention and happy to answer any question you may have.
Thank you so much, Giselle. That was fantastic and really interesting. I will hand over to Anna now, and we'll come to the questions after we've heard from both of you, if that's okay. So Anna, over to you.
Yeah, so now I'm muted as well. Thank you very much for the introduction. My talk will be focused on patient-facing studies. In particular, I would like to talk about natural history studies for rare neuromuscular disorders. And also for sake of time, I had to focus a little bit on one aspect of the patient-facing studies. So we talk about congenital muscle disorders, and in particular, we know that these are conditions that present at birth with weakness and hypotonia. And there are many types of neuromuscular conditions that can present at birth, but our interest currently for this talk is mostly on the congenital onset myopathies and muscular dystrophies, which often present at birth. And the difference between these two groups, as we know, is that muscular dystrophies are usually more progressive in nature and are associated with higher values of creatine kinase in the bloodstream, and the biopsy is often dystrophic. Now, we know that these conditions are currently supported by international standards of care. We have family guides available for these conditions, and these help really proactive management and help with respiratory and cardiac surveillance, and really survival and quality of life of patients has improved. All of these conditions, however, are genetically determined, and there is no cure yet for any of these genetically inherited early onset condition. So what is really the way to treatment and to identify therapies for patients is quite complex, but there are clear steps that can help us to arrive to an earlier treatment. So first of all, we need to provide diagnosis for all patients and then understand epidemiology, which conditions are more common in some populations. But really, one of the most important steps that helps to identify new therapies is define natural history and deep phenotype the condition to understand really well what are the clinical problems that patients present and how these evolve over time. So what is natural history? What is the definition of this term? We hear it a lot. This is the course of the disease in absence of any interventions from the onset until either the disease resolution or death. This is the definition. Now, natural history can change, and there are quite a lot of co-founders. And this picture really gives you an idea of the different natural histories, in particular for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is quite a well-known condition over years and has been studied quite well. So age can define and change natural history, genetic backgrounds, environmental factors, but most importantly, standards of care and treatment. So we know how much natural history of Duchenne muscular dystrophy has changed since introduction of ventilation and start of steroid therapy. So why is it important to understand natural history? Because this can help us to counsel, anticipate burden of disease, support development of intervention. So we know that there is onset of a specific medical problem. We know how to start developing and supporting this condition, but also can help us to inform future clinical studies about which are the disease endpoints that we want to choose. For example, if a condition is characterized by respiratory involvement, maybe we can use that as an endpoint to see if the disease is working, but also help us understand what is the sample size that we want to study. If it's a condition that very rapidly progress, you might need less patients to assess the efficacy of a treatment. So really a precise knowledge of the natural history is key to understand efficacy and safety of a particular intervention. So depending on the purpose of the study that we want to have, there are different types of studies that we can have. So cross-sectional, when we look at one time point at all the patient, you can do longitudinal, that you look at different time points and look at the changes over time. You can do a retrospective study. When you go backwards, you look at the chart notes in the past and you see over the years in the data that you collected in the time. Or prospective, you have a study that starts today and you go over the years and see in the future how the things evolve. So you could have chart reviews, you have disease registries, or you have a protocol-driven natural history study. Now, clearly, there is much more. These studies are very different, and you might have different resources, time, personnel that you might need to do chart reviews or protocol-driven natural history studies, and the quality of data that you have is very different. Chart reviews are retrospective, and you only have what you collected in the past. And if the data was not collected, that's it. You can't go backwards. Clearly, protocol-driven natural history studies are the best, but really they need a lot of time. You need, in particular, you might need to have years and years of assessment of patients, and that clearly are much more time-consuming. Genotype-phenotype correlation is a slightly different concept. It's the association between the nature and the location of a specific gene change, the genotype, and the resulting disease expression, which is the phenotype. And we know that congenital muscular dystrophies are very heterogeneous. We have many genes that cause different types of conditions. So we just heard about LMNA gene, but we have so many other genes. And each of these genes, according to their genotype, we can have different phenotypic expression. And Giselle just really elegantly explained about the phenotypic differences according to the gene change in LMNA. But this might be the case in many other genes, like for example, in LAMA2 gene associated with myelin deficient muscular dystrophy. So it's very complicated, really. But this is actually very important because this can help with diagnosis, risk stratify, and also manage better patients. So a lot has been done over the years, really. We have quite a lot of genotype-phenotype correlation studies. We have done large cross-sectional studies, for example, in the UK, we looked at all the patients in the UK and tried to define the epidemiology and the natural history of the various conditions. But we done retrospective study, and also longitudinal studies have been done. Now, we know quite a lot in terms of the presentation of this condition from these cross-sectional studies. We know the data gathered can help to give us an idea on the mobility, the respiratory involvement, feeding difficulties, but these are snapshots, and cross-sectional studies don't give us much of longitudinal data. We looked at also at the phenotypic differences for different type of congenital muscular dystrophies. And this, not only gives us an idea about the phenotypic differences between different genes, but also give us an idea about the prevalences. And we know that, for example, MDC1A associated with LAMA2 gene mutations are the most common in the UK as a type of muscular dystrophy. So can I, just for sake of time, I will focus mostly on this condition to give you an idea about type of natural history studies that has been done for this type of condition, LAMA2 gene-related muscular dystrophy. And we know that this is a very early onset condition that, in addition to muscle weakness, also associated with central nervous system involvement and associated with the high CK, but relevant disease burden with major respiratory involvement, with patient needing ventilation from early age, scoliosis, and feeding difficulties with need for feeding support. But this condition is quite variable. We know that patients with the same mutation or slightly different mutation can have milder presentation. And sometimes the effect of the variant might be dissimilar, and you might have patients with complete medicine deficiency that present with milder presentation. And we know that there is also interfamilial variability with patients with the same families with very severe respiratory involvement, but being ambulant versus other family members who, for example, have no ambulation. So what are the effects of maybe other genes on the phenotypic presentation of these patients? So there's quite a lot to understand. So this is why we need longitudinal studies. And there has been a study at the NIH led by Karsten Bonneman that looked into longitudinal changes, and they followed 24 patients with LAMA2RD, and they noticed some changes over time in the MFM32, the physiotherapy, the functional score assessment in LAMA2, but respiratory assessments with FVC did not notice significant changes in patients with LAMA2 in this study. Maybe because the patients were already in quite a severe respiratory deficiency, and therefore the changes could not be noticed. We did a retrospective study in our center. We looked into patients with complete medicine deficiency, and we looked at data gathered for over years and years of assessments in our center. And we noticed we managed to assess changes in the joint range, in the scoliosis, but in particular, we managed to observe changes in the respiratory function with the decline of their FVC over the years, thanks to this long time assessment. And similar data has also been collected in the US by the group of Jim Collins. Now, this information is very helpful because it really gives you an idea about the sample size. If you want to do a longitudinal study, how many patients you might need to have to observe a change of a treatment that you are having. You really need large cohort of patients. And this also helps us to assess, for example, what is the median age to start ventilation. I'm going to go quickly here, but we also looked at observationally what are the mobility, assess mobility abilities of the patients. It really gives you an idea about what is the age of patient to achieve certain abilities. And this a similar retrospective study has also been ongoing at the NIH now to understand really the motor function, the motor development of children with this condition. So clearly we need prospective longitudinal studies, and we, because these are rare diseases, it's very difficult to do this in one single center. So what we need to do is to join together efforts to maximize cohort sizes and increase quality of data. And this is now being done for LAMA2, but also for other conditions like for selenon. And we know already that first phase 1 studies have been completed for not only LAMA2, but also Collagen 6 for a first drug. And this is really more to understand feasibility and safety of some early drugs that are being developed. And finally, just my last slide is that some of this study will also apply imaging, which could be a very good possible outcome measure to understand progression over time of this condition and possible efficacy of drugs that are applied. So in conclusion, really knowledge of natural history and genotype phenotype correlation is really important, because really can help us to understand not only course of the disease, but effect of some new drugs that are being developed. But it's important that we also understand other factors that are associated with phenotypic variability. But first of all, it's very important that all the patients receive genetic diagnosis. So MDUK has actually supported one of our studies in understanding the genetic background of the patients that still are undiagnosed, and really continue to collaborate internationally to set up these larger natural history studies. So really we should to continue these collaborative efforts, not only for these conditions, but all rare neuromuscular diseases. And that was my last slide. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm here to if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you again, Giselle, for your presentations. It's been really fascinating. I've learned a lot, so thank you. I have got a couple of questions for you. First of all, there was a question we've received about whether there is a registry for people who have congenital muscular dystrophies. Anna, you're nodding, so I'm going to go to you to answer that one.
Yes, there are registries. The largest registry is the International Registry of QCMD that involves all patients with congenital muscular dystrophy. There are also registries that are specific for specific conditions. And I know that countries also have specific registries on national level. And also we need to be aware also of mutation databases, which is very important. Maybe Giselle, you might want to add on that.
Yeah, for laminopathic conditions, in France, we have a patient registry called HOPAL, and it's at a national level at the present time, but we are working hard at the present time to open it and to move it to European level and international level. But we are facing kind of regulation and administrative burden, but we are working hard on that. And we have also a mutation database, human mutation, UMD LMNA database that is available online, which collect only, I would say, all the case report in the literature or in the different laboratory, and is the mutation is associated with the main disease phenotype. But there is this mutation database does not allow to have a prospective view of the evolution of the disease. That's why we had set up this mutation database first, and now we have moved to a patient registry dedicated to all type of laminopathy, OPAL registry. And in that, we include all the clinical detail of every subject carrying a mutation and following them along the years. So it should help to establish prospective natural history in the future, to help to make all the stratification Anna presented for other conditions, and be prepared at any time for any potential trial whenever we have some things to test and to help the therapy for patients.
Thank you. That's that's preempting my next question. And just to point out actually that on the MDUK website under the research section, we do have some information and links to some registries. So the Congenital Muscular Dystrophy registry that Anna mentioned, that is run by a group that another charity based in the US called CureCMD. There's a link there, and we also, as an organisation ourselves, support the Collagen 6 registry, which collects information on people who have variations in their collagen 6 genes. So there are registries out there, and if people are interested, please do go look at the website, and there are some links there. So that's fantastic. Thank you.
If I may just add, I think it is very helpful if you can ask your clinicians, if you don't know this registry, the clinician should be able to point you in direction. But I think it's really something that it's really a benefit for everybody to be registered, because you can gather information, and not just for us clinicians, but for the family. It is very helpful to be on a registry.
Super. Yes, thank you indeed. So one obviously collecting the data is fantastic, and we're learning so much, and you've shown how over time, even with the implementation of standards of care, you can see the change in people's natural history. But obviously, one would like to think that there will be treatments coming down the line for any number of the congenital muscular dystrophies, some of which we've spoken about today, and others that we haven't necessarily touched on. Giselle, Anna, are there any clinical trials and glimmers of hope down the line coming for any of these conditions? I'll go to you first, Anna.
Well, I mentioned the Callisto study, which was the omega pill drug trial that was done in the US. Although this was a phase 1 study, it's very important, because actually setting up clinical trials for rare diseases like muscular dystrophies is quite challenging. And we need, really, it's very important that we identify the right outcome measures, because otherwise you would spend a lot of money for no outcome. And I think we really learned a lot about, for example, SMA and Duchenne muscular dystrophy, about some studies where had limited efficacy, and maybe also because of the outcome measures were not the right one. So I think there are quite a lot of progress, and I think LAMA2 disease has been something that is a field where there has been quite a lot of progress, and there are quite a lot of discussion with possible interventional trials, but I think we're not there yet, apart from the omega pill. And this is why there's the effort for this larger natural history study, because there is discussion about alternative proteins that could possibly overcome the lack of the amylin alpha 2, or also gene modifier therapies. So there is quite a lot of discussion about this. And for collagen 6, there's also possible gene modifier therapies where you actually try to silence the gene with the mutation, carrying the mutation as a dominant form of collagenopathy. But we're still in the early phases, so we're not there yet for clinical trials yet. These are for the most common muscular dystrophies.
Thank you. And Giselle, is there anything else that you want to add?
For the LMNA congenital muscular dystrophies, there is no per se direct trial ongoing, but for other type of laminopathies, for the cardiomyopathies, so the adult cardiac disease linked to lamine mutation, there is an ongoing trial to test an inhibitor of P38. This molecule help to slow down the cardiac disease progression. So in a sense, it's so far it's as far as I remember, it's for adult cases only, this trial. But anyway, the outcome of this trial for the adult population carrying lamine mutation with dilated cardiomyopathy, that is the same disease as in the congenital form, may, if positive, have some interest for the congenital population, because this population have the cardiac disease much earlier than adults. So these are the ongoing trial I know about, and of course research work hard to find either to identify molecules that could slow down the disease progression, or also we have ongoing project to develop some gene therapy to remove the disease mutation and put back the correct level of correct protein in the body to work correctly. So this is a much longer perspective, the gene therapy approaches, but well, we try to work on both sides, slowing down the progression of the disease, and there is for cardiac disease, which is the main burden for patients, to slow down, and then hopefully we might come with good news for the patients. But fantastic. As you know, everything takes time.
Yeah.
And research time is not patient time, unfortunately.
Yes, yeah, and it takes time still to go through the rigorous protocols for clinical trials, which obviously is the right thing to do. It's just it is a slow process. And when we're looking at rare or very rare conditions, finding the patients across the whole world to be part of the clinical trial is obviously a challenge as well. We've been sort of speaking quite a lot about sort of the congenital and the sort of the childhood conditions, but actually, of course, there are, as you mentioned already, Giselle, there are adults with conditions as well. And if people have a sort of a diagnosis and yet they haven't got a gene identified yet, how can we advise people who perhaps are looking to think about having children in the future if we don't know what their gene is? Have you got any advice about that? I don't know whether Anna, maybe again I can come to you first.
Okay, so I think it's very important that if you have a possible neuromuscular condition and you have no diagnosis, that you should go to your clinician, either your GP or if you're still below 18, to see a pediatrician to get the referral. And I think it's very important that there is as much effort put into identifying the missing gene, you know, the gene. Sometimes some new genes have been discovered over the years and you might have not been tested yet for that gene. And it's very difficult to give any, you know, counseling, reproductive risk in absence of the gene change. But it's very important that that if that's the case anyway, to see a clinical geneticist to discuss about options. Mm-hmm. So it's very important.
And there is a lot more now within the NHS as well as with genetic testing.
Yes, exactly. So now there might be something that could be offered that was not available maybe 5-10 years ago. We are now able to offer whole genome sequencing. But just keep in mind that despite this availability, these tests take very long time. So if somebody really, it's not something that could be done in a few weeks or months. Still today, some of these tests can take months and months. So just to keep in mind, particularly if there's plan for, you know, family planning and so on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. And Giselle, you mentioned about some of the studies you're doing. You're taking muscle biopsy. You know, we can understand muscle biopsy. You're looking at muscles. That makes sense. But you also mentioned that you're looking at skin fibroblasts. So how does looking at skin tell us something about muscle?
Actually, we try to preserve also the patient in a way. So we know that a muscle biopsy is very invasive, and skin biopsy might be lighter for patient perspective to provide some patient material. And what we develop in our center and elsewhere as well, I think, is to transform the skin cells that we can put in a culture dish, and we transform the skin in a kind of muscle cells. So we transform them, and doing so, we can, in a sense, try to explore the mechanism of the mutation and understand what's happening by moving from skin cells to muscle cells. It's a indirect model we set up. It's not a perfect one. Obviously, having muscle cells is our preferred option. But at the same time, we understand that some patients can be very reluctant to provide biopsies from their muscles, as they already have muscle difficulties. So taking on top of this additional biopsy, it can be a pain. So the alternative is the skin biopsy that can help. Mm-hmm. So again, we much prefer muscle, but in case there is no possibility to get access to the muscles, we have developed tools to try to go and bypass the absence of muscle cells and try to transform them in muscle. It's not as perfect as the muscle, but it can help anyway in our project. And we are, at the present time, we are comparing the results because we have the chance for a few patients to have both muscle and skin. and we compare the results we get out of the two type of biopsy to see whether we can get similar results.
I
For
see.
some aspect, it's working well. For some other, we still need muscle, but
Okay.
we try, try to not disturb too much patients, but of course, as I say, muscle is the best, but.
And this applies also for other, also for, luckily, there are some other muscle conditions where skin biopsy can help, like alpha-dystroglycanopathies, can be helpful.
Collagen 6,
Collagen
6, skin is preferred in a way, because the defect is in the cells that produce the collagen, and the cells that produce mostly the collagen are the fibroblasts present also in the skin.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. There's a question from someone who has a recessively inherited congenital myopathy, which is caused by two faults in the, now I'm going to have to read this out, SCN4A gene. And the person is asking where they can find out more information about the progress, because it's incredibly rare. Anna, can you help?
Yeah, so I mean, this condition has been described a few years back, and we knew that this condition causes a type of channelopathy, which is a slightly different condition, but usually patients don't have fixed weakness, but there are some recessive variants that cause congenital myopathy. I mean, I don't know if this patient is seen, this family is seen in the UK. So we in the London, we are the reference center for congenital myopathy, so they could contact us, or the clinician can contact us. There have been some papers already published for this condition that gives an idea about the course of the disease, but it's quite rare, probably underdiagnosed. So there might be more people that have not been studied yet and identified yet. But the highly specialized service in the UK for this condition, myopathies and channelopathies together, can offer advice.
Brilliant, thank you. That's great. And both of you have touched on international collaboration, and again, I guess that this is something that's vitally important when we're looking at very rare diseases. And can you just sort of say a little bit about how these work? How do you find the people to work with? Giselle, I maybe look to you first.
Yeah, I presented the international retrospective natural history studies we made. How we touch people. We know going to different congress and meeting at the international level, we know colleagues working on those conditions, and so we contacted all neuropediatricians working on congenital muscular dystrophy and asked them whether they have patients with this condition, and propose them to collaborate on this project. And this was it's take time actually, because the natural history studies that we published in the scientific journal last year was initiated in 2014 with a simple Excel sheet that was spread to neuropediatrician, and then the time to collect and control all the data filled in and to make statistic, it was a bit of a pain, but so now with all registries going on, might be a bit easier, and we know what item we want to collect, what question we ask, and all neuropediatrician or geneticists are more and more aware of the question, because all the muscular dystrophy condition share in a way some common features. So all these are classically stored in the medical record. It's just to have the tools to collect and authorization to collect as well.
And Anna?
Yeah, I think there's not much else to add to this, but the only thing maybe is just that we appreciate that this also involves maybe also gathering more and more data when we see patients in clinic. And I do appreciate that sometimes it might be quite long consultation, long physiotherapy assessment, and but it's really so useful. I mean, the data that we gather on the regular follow-ups of patients is of its incredible value. And again, I bring up Duchenne and SMA because the power of this larger cohort databases like the North Star and the SMA Reach in the UK is so useful now to develop drugs and monitor in real life drugs. So if we start collecting systematically data, even if they are held in single centers, but if the data is similar, be collected in many centers, then we can merge them together and gather. And it takes a lot of effort, really.
And I think probably, I'm mindful of time, probably this will be my last question for you both, but are you aware of research and studies that are being carried out in adults with these conditions, or very much focused on the children's side?
For
oh, go on, Giselle. No, go, Giselle, please go.
For Lamin's conditions, for sure, our registries focus on any patient carrying LMNA gene variant mutations. So that compile clinical data on any type of so-called laminopathies, from congenital muscular dystrophy to isolated cardiac disease, but also the mutations that affect adipose tissue or even premature aging. So it's very broad, and having all the detail for the different conditions linked to any type of lamin mutations, genes mutations, is very important, because we can have clear idea of overlaps between the different conditions and better understand why this mutation gives rise to muscle disease, or why another mutation gives rise to another disease. And it's really important to collect as much as possible, as Anna said during the consultation, any detail of the patient progression and symptoms, etc. Because at the present time, in 2 weeks of time, it might not change anything, but the accumulation of all the data collected with all the new means that use statistics and artificial intelligence to analyze all this data might be very helpful for all of us to design and stratify different population ready to any test in the future. So preparing now will help future.
Fantastic. And Anna, is there anything?
Yeah, no, the only other thing is that we know, as we mentioned before, that the secondary dystroglycanopathies, there is the milder end of the spectrum, which is the adult late onset limb-girdle muscular dystrophies, and there are studies ongoing for these conditions, which are mostly relevant for adults because they're more common in adults. So I know that there are some phase 1-2 studies ongoing for all the patients with LGMD2I, the R9, which is the FKRP1, where there's also possible gene therapy approaches as well being considered. So there are ongoing studies, and hopefully some outcomes of those studies might be relevant and translatable for younger and more severe presentations as well.
Fantastic. So I think the sort of take home is as well that what we're learning from one set of studies can actually, the information can be applied elsewhere, which is always fantastic to know. So I think in the interest of time, I will hand over to Niru now. Thank you, Giselle and Anna, so much. It's been a really great session. I've enjoyed it immensely. Hopefully other people have as well. And we'll now sort of, hopefully you'll be able to stay with us to talk about living with the congenital muscular dystrophies. Niru, back to you.
Thank you, Kate. So now we're going to move on to the living well and managing congenital muscular dystrophy section. So many thanks to Kate, Giselle and Anna. And now I'm pleased to welcome 4 more panelists to join us. After I've introduced them, I'll invite each one of them to say a few words about their experience of congenital muscular dystrophy and the support they provide before moving into questions and discussion. So firstly, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Phil Davis. Phil is a consultant in paediatric respiratory medicine at the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow. He trained in Cambridge, Manchester and Cardiff before moving to Glasgow in 2008 as a consultant. His interests include children on long-term ventilation, sleep medicine, and children with neuromuscular disorders. He runs a regular multidisciplinary neurorespiratory clinic that manages children with neuromuscular disorders throughout the west of Scotland and has worked closely with the Scottish Muscle Network for many years. I'd also like to introduce Emily Johnson. Emily's a speech and language therapist, qualifying with a degree in speech and language pathology and psychology from the University of Newcastle in 1999. She's a joint team lead for the speech and language therapy in patients and feeding service at the Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. Her post at Great Ormond Street focuses on special speech and language therapy assessment and management of both feeding, swallowing, and communication difficulties in infants, children, and young people. She's a member of the multidisciplinary neuromuscular team based at Great Ormond Street, and Emily is a member of the teaching facility for FINE, which is Family and Infant Neurodevelopment Education. Over recent years, she's been involved in introducing the program in Romania also. She has an interest in prematurity and neonatal feeding experiences and the transition from tube to oral feeding. She's currently involved in an NIHR-funded study investigating this called CUBS study, if I've pronounced that correctly. I'd also like to welcome Jenny Sheehan. Jenny Sheehan's a clinical specialist paediatric physiotherapist at Evelina London Children's Hospital and has over 30 years experience in working in neuromuscular disorders, mostly in paediatrics, but also adult neuromuscular disease work also. Jenny developed an interest in neuromuscular disorders when working in paediatrics at the Hammersmith Hospital with Professor Dunwoods many years ago, and also with Professor Montoni. I have pronounced that wrong, I do apologize, fully aware of that, and was involved in clinical and research work there. Jenny moved to Guy's Hospital in a post initially funded by MDUK, working with both pediatrics and adult neuromuscular disease with Professor Richard Hughes and Dr. Stephanie Robb. As the caseload increased, Jenny returned to paediatric neuromuscular disorders, which was now NHS funded only. And with time she had time to expand her physiotherapy team. Jenny and her team moved to the service at Evelina London 12 years ago, and the service has expanded further. Jenny runs physiotherapy-only neuromuscular clinics, in addition to multidisciplinary team clinics with 3 consultants. Jenny also runs some outreach clinics and is involved in teaching and service development. And finally, I'd like to introduce Nick Emery. So Nick Emery is a neuromuscular clinical specialist physiotherapist at the Orthopaedic Hospital, Robert Jones and Angus Hunt Orthopaedic and District Hospital in Oswestry Street. Prior to qualifying as a physiotherapist, Nick was a Royal Marine Commando and then a firefighter for 17 to 18 years. During this time, Nick attended various courses to become a qualified sports therapist and ran a successful private clinic in Mile End. In 2000, Nick was medically retired from the London Fire Service, so qualified as a physiotherapist in 2005. After qualifying, Nick's first position was at the Neuromuscular Centre in Winsford, where he spent nearly 5 years and then moved to the Oswestry Street Centre. At the Oswestry Street Centre, Nick's time, he's worked in 2 specialist areas for around 6 to 7 years: orthopaedic research and the locomotor assessment unit. a department assessing gait and the provision of orthotics to improve gait and function. And he's also worked alongside a specialist team treating children and young adults with a range of conditions. So what I'd like to now do is just hand over to Phil. And Phil, could you please talk us through how respiratory management can support with the care of children with congenital muscular dystrophy?
Yes, thank you for your introduction. And it's very interesting to be part of such a diverse and experienced panel. Just to sort of give a little bit of background about how I've approached it. So I'm based in Glasgow. I look after children from really throughout the west of Scotland, going out right into the north of Scotland. So people with all sorts of neuromuscular disorders. And obviously from a congenital muscular dystrophy point of view, having a whole variety of conditions, many of which we've been discussing this morning, we can be really dealing with an extraordinary variation in the levels and the age of onset of those conditions. And so having good information regarding diagnostics is obviously very useful to try and give you some sort of insight into what the natural history of these conditions might be, and therefore when you are going to need to be involved, and the kind of expectations that you might have in terms of the need for respiratory support, and how you might actually sort of talk to families about that natural progression and the levels of support that you might need to progress. I quite like getting involved quite early in the management of these children. And again, depends upon the natural history of the condition. Even just having a conversation with families early on to say, look, this is our service, we exist. We may not be needed in any significant way for quite a long time, but to know that we're here, to know that we are looking out for this and we're part of a team that can be accessed is important. And I think this is this idea about introducing a team, which is the thing. And I work as a part of a regular multidisciplinary team. And that's in terms of our regular clinics, may involve neurologists, but very specifically chest physiotherapists, dietitians are involved in the team. We have also specialist nurses, and we have access to a lot more specialist investigation, physiology services, and so on. And again, depending upon how you the disorders is, that what sort of you need to bring in at what point in time. And I suppose the things that should bring out quite early in terms of respiratory management of neuromuscular disease is it's often unseen. It's something which can creep up on you without actually really being aware of it, and particularly symptoms start to develop in a way which people either, well, actually, first of all, symptoms may not develop, and we know that helping and supporting people, they do better. And so things that creep up without being expected, we often start to screen for and look for, otherwise we don't notice it. And also the other side is that actually symptoms may be developing, but people just put it down to, as they get a bit older, their actual underlying neuromuscular condition. And so again, the idea that actually when you go back and treat things well, then you can actually prevent complications in advance. So a lot of what I do is about prevention of complications, and really just the knowledge of the fact that if we support people from a respiratory breathing point of view, then actually we can prevent short-term complications and improve things in the long term. And I suppose there are sort of a few key elements that I would be looking for to talk to in terms of how respiratory management can support people with neuromuscular disease. And broadly speaking, I think they fall into the two main categories of respiratory infection prevention and then looking for signs of hypoventilation, that's to say under breathing, particularly at night time, and then investigating and then to be able to support that. So there's these two main remits, really, from my point of view, which I look for and obviously work with more closely with the team to how we help with that. So, for example, in terms of respiratory infections, as people may get weaker, breathing we think of as being a lung thing, but obviously breathing is a muscular thing as much as it is a lung-related thing. And so young people at various different stages of the disorder may well develop problems with their respiratory muscles, and therefore you start to have an ability, for example, to cough. To cough, you have to take a deep breath in. You have to be able to close your glottis adequately to build up pressure, and then you need to be able to burst out that cough to clear out your airways. And without that, at any of those levels, if you can't take a deep breath in, you can't adequately, if you like, load the gun to fire out and clear out those secretions. And so again, we have a very good physiotherapy support. I have a physiotherapist on the, at least one physiotherapist in this panel, so they will talk about the detail about how that's done. But having that person as part of the team and supporting people and providing different techniques, adjuncts, ambibag cough assist machines, what have you, are all important parts of that. Children will get respiratory infections and they can take off really quite quickly. And as secretions build up, they can get up and get more significant. And before you know it, you can quite rapidly then, because you can't cough so well, start to go down a rapid downward spiral. So I would advocate still pretty early treatment of antibiotics, for example, and at a stage when you perhaps that threshold would be different if you didn't have an underlying neuromuscular condition. There are things to watch out specifically. There may be issues, for example, with safety of swallow. And again, aspiration may be an issue with some people. Reflux, again, may be issues with people. Again, we'll be looking out for those issues as time goes on. And things like influenza vaccination, obviously COVID has been a big deal of part of people's lives in the last few years. Again, if there are active things we can do to prevent. So those are all important. Other aspects not directly related to respiratory, but potentially have a major knock-on consequence, which again, Nick will talk about, I'm sure, in terms of orthotics and prevention of problems of things like scoliosis development and input with these issues, all have potential knock-on respiratory consequences, and in terms of infection and in terms of how people do from a respiratory breathing point of view. So the very active point of view in terms of how we manage that, we treat early, and we're being proactive in infection management. And then the other side, which we would look at, would be very much more to do with the idea of hypoventilation. And we know that, I mean, obviously people get very anxious about that, particularly if you have a predictable disorder such as Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It is seen by many families as being a milestone moment if ventilation is required. And it's a big deal and people don't want that. But so I talk about this very early on. And over the years, I think since we started doing that, I found that families are much more accepting that this is actually just part of what we do. And yes, okay, it's there, we don't rather it wasn't there, but we know people do better if we do support that. And so we start to do screening, for example, initially, for example, with spirometry readings, and we look for measures of forced vital capacity, for example, to see whether or not that starts to dip down. And if that starts to dip down, then we might do more detailed tests. That would be the case for something like Duchenne. But obviously, there are many more, say, conditions that affect much younger children where you can't do those sort of things. And you may just simply start doing regular investigations, often sleep studies. Sleep's a time we all slightly underbreathe. And that's the time when things start to show, and particularly during dreaming sleep. And that's when we're particularly relaxed. And so more subtle things start to come along at those times. And again, the evidence of exactly when you might need to start, for example, mask ventilation to try and support that breathing is very limited. It's based around very small numbers of studies which have looked at, we know when people start to have retained CO2 at nighttime is a time when they start to do less well by day eventually. So we like to intervene before that. So doing sleep studies, looking potentially, I mean, I particularly like to get oxygen and capnography, or more detailed studies as well if your units have the capacity to do that. And I start doing that when I get concerned. And then the other aspect then is the ability then to start and support, for example, things like mask ventilation. And again, having a team of people in our unit, that's a team of physiologists. In other units, it's nursing staff. Whoever's experience really is the key thing, to be able to do that. And again, to deal with complications early, because it does sometimes feel a bit strange. It does take a bit of getting used to. Not everybody gets the immediate benefit. Some people do. But in fact, I found that this patient group actually is very open to this type of treatment often. But things go wrong. People get pressure sores. It starts to get a leak and will blow into people's eyes. It starts to sort of just become uncomfortable and not working. And again, having a really close relationship to get in early and deal with problems, I find is important. So I suppose that it is that team, it is knowing what is out there, it's good communication with families, and it's about the idea of watching and monitoring as time goes on. And I kind of see that's the role that we play in respiratory.
Thank you, Phil, for that detailed and very quick outline of respiratory care. And I think early management is what we find we get questions about at our helpline. And it's just the daunting idea of having to use respiratory equipment like ventilators, and even simple things like masks. They're always questions that we get through our helpline. So thank you, Phil, for that. That's really, really helpful. And I'm sure we'll have a couple of questions a bit later for you. So now I'd like to hand it over to Emily, please. Could you just talk us through how access to speech and language therapy can improve living well with congenital muscular dystrophy?
So as a speech and language therapist in a hospital setting, I primarily focus on feeding and swallow safety, but also communication is very much part of our role. And, you know, as Phil very articulately said, congenital muscular dystrophy is a huge range and variation, and your swallow and communication function can be hit in multiple different ways. So if, you know, for some conditions, you will have met a speech and language therapist very early on because feeding challenges can be so much part of your very early presentation and when you're diagnosed. And when we think about feeding and swallowing difficulties, I think quite often by the time we get to a clinical setting, it can be can feed, can't feed. But as a speech and language therapist, we're trying to look at all those steps along the way. So I think living well is knowing the kind of intricacies of your own or your child's swallow function. And when we're thinking about that, we're thinking kind of, is your swallow safe? So Phil talked a bit about aspiration and the function of your breathing system and your glottis and your cough, which are all very much involved in your swallow function. We have this kind of shared air and food way, which can be challenged when your muscles are weak and need to move quickly, smoothly and strongly. Is it sustainable? So can you eat enough in a reasonable amount of time to grow and develop well? And also, is it pleasurable? So we've done the kind of hard science behind it, but eating and communication are huge ways in which we express ourselves and socialize. And I work with children who might be on a full oral diet that is completely normal, a full oral diet that is very much adapted and accommodated to their individual capacities to eat safely, or a combination of tube and oral feeding. And that might be right down to a combination of just a tiny taste of food on your lips once or twice a day. But so much about what we do when we eat and drink isn't about how much we can shove down our throats as quickly as possible to grow. It's about all the other kind of social and interactive components. So I think living well is kind of working out what meets those criteria for that individual. Is it safe? Is it sustainable? Is it pleasurable? And then the kind of monitoring over time, because I think Phil touched on it, what we can do with kind of long-term conditions that might change over time is adapt and accommodate in a way that we might not know we're doing. So in a quick clinical setting where you might be answering tens and tens of questions about different things, if somebody says, how's your eating and drinking going? And you just say fine, that may well be ticked and moved on from. And actually with a bit more exploration, you know, as a patient or a parent, kind of thinking, has anything changed over the recent years? Are we doing things a bit differently to another child I know who hasn't got this condition? Can help with that sort of monitoring of change and support along the way. Have mealtime suddenly become an hour and a half when they used to be 45 minutes. So I think they would be the elements I would be considering.
Thank you, Emily, for that, all that information, and their questions that do come up as well. And I think it's very individual focused, isn't it, in terms of the need of individuals, and it varies dramatically. Thank you, Emily. So now I'd like to hand over to Jenny. Jenny, could you give us an overview of the kinds of physiotherapy support that you and your colleagues provide, and also why it's important in the care of children with congenital muscular dystrophy?
Yes, thank you, Nero. So as a specialist centre, we are doing assessments of the children. So that might be in a joint clinic jointly with the neurologist where we're doing the hands-on assessment, or it might be in my own physiotherapy clinic, which I would do with another physiotherapist. So we're doing assessments of the children for outcome measures. And we're not just doing that because we're recording the outcome measures. We're doing it in order to enable us to manage that child's physical health. So when we're measuring muscle power, most of the children actually really enjoy it. But the reason we're doing it is not to record, oh yes, this has got worse. What I'm doing is looking and thinking, okay, maybe the quadriceps have got worse, and that might explain why an ambulant child has started to fall. And then that might be something that we need to direct treatment to. So when we look at the whole child, we are going to, unfortunately, find lots of problems, and we can't address everything, but we need to, what it's all about really is their function and their ability to access life and school and enjoyment and sports. And that obviously might be adapted sports, but that's something that we all need to enjoy, and children particularly enjoy. So we're looking at joint range, and so we might advocate passive stretching to maintain joint range. And the reason for doing that is, again, to help with function, but also to try and avoid pain, because if you get a joint which is very stuck in one position, it's uncomfortable. And it can affect seating, it can affect your position lying in bed, and then your position you're lying in bed may affect your respiratory function, and everything ties together. I look very closely at spinal posture. So we're addressing that and look for early signs of change, early signs of scoliosis. So we work closely with the spinal team, and I would refer to them when I felt that was necessary. I work very closely with the orthotic team, so I might prescribe orthoses, anything from insoles to AFOs, ankle foot orthoses, to a spinal brace. And again, that all relates to function and how we can make things better for the child and how to help the child be in a better place long term and when they reach adulthood. And some of the things we have to do may be promoting walking. So I might use CAFOs, knee ankle foot orthoses to help them with walking. We might recommend standing frames because weight bearing is important for bones and muscles. But the other side of that is sometimes we need to recognise and explain to families when standing and walking is no longer appropriate. So if there's asymmetry of spinal posture or asymmetry of contractures, then standing and walking might not be the right thing. It might be that walking is something that a child no longer enjoys. And so part of that process is then recognising the need for a wheelchair. And that's something that families, parents often don't want, usually don't want, but the child might actually welcome that because that's a different way of independence. So sometimes it's a combination. We might be saying, oh, walk for these activities, stand for these activities, but use a wheelchair to get from A to B and save your energy. So it's that sort of balance. I don't work as a respiratory physiotherapist. We're very lucky at Evelina that we have the acute respiratory physios, and we also have a physio specialist in long-term ventilation. So I work closely with them, but they're the ones that follow the respiratory outcome measures and intervention. But that said, I would recognise if a child was having some difficulty, one of the subjective questions would be, as Emily had said, about meal times and if things are taking longer, and that might be a postural thing. So that is something that we would address. It might be a respiratory thing, and we would refer onto the respiratory team. There's something else I was going to say. Oh, occupational therapy is another need that we do have an OT at Evelina, but not as much input. So we would recognise where that was needed and refer onwards. The other huge part of my role is we're seeing the children 2 or 3 times a year, but they have community physiotherapists, and the community physios might only have one child with congenital muscular dystrophy on their caseload. They might never have seen a child with this before. So my role is to advise them and advise on equipment, and then advise on a physio program. So most of that program needs to be carried out by the parents or possibly the one-to-one support assistant at school, but it needs to be guided by the community physios. So we've got a bit of a cascade process going on. So I would advise from a specialist point of view, then we need the community physiotherapist to help input that, and then the parents to be carrying out the program. But that program needs to be regularly looked at, and what might be appropriate for a small baby is probably not appropriate for a teenager. One of the other things that we might sometimes implement, particularly in babies, is serial casting. So some children with congenital muscular dystrophy are born with talipes equinovarus, and we treat that in our Ponseti clinic with serial casting and then following up with splinting. And again, that's an option that we might use if we felt there was a benefit in serial casting, which is repeated plaster casts put on. But that always has to be with what are we aiming for and what's the reason for it. So I think that's a summary of what we do.
Thank you, Jenny. That's a great summary of what you do. And it's really interesting to hear about how you work in collaboration with other teams and other specialisms, because as Phil said at the beginning, that many things have knock-on effects on other issues that may come up with managing and living well with conditions. So I'd like to now hand over to Nick. Nick, could you please talk us through the kind of physiotherapy support you and your colleagues provide and why it's so important in the care of adults with CMD?
Yeah, I will do. I'm going to start slightly in the paediatric realm and then move through to the adult. I think that one of the most important times for both the teenager, the young adult moving through into adult care is that transition period, and also that's very important for the parents of those children or teenagers, because at that period of time there's a huge change generally. I mean, we're quite lucky here at Oswestry, we don't have that transition. We see a seamless service right from birth right the way through, but at lots of hospitals you see that transition. So all of a sudden you're moving, you're seeing different consultants, you're seeing different physios, you're having to learn a new team. And I think that's a really difficult time for parents and teenagers. And also you're going to be moving from maybe a respiratory consultant, you're going to be moving your cardiac consultant, you're going to suddenly start losing your community physio care. And that's quite a traumatic time. And I think that needs to be dealt with very carefully. And I know it is, but I just wanted to raise that because it's that time. And I think that is quite an anxious time for both the person with the CMD and also the parents of that child. So from looking through from the adult side of things, if they come to us with a diagnosis already, that's slightly easier, that we can just carry on with that care, adapt it as their needs change. But as we get an adult who comes with a new referral and then they're looking for that diagnosis, that's quite a traumatic time for them, their family, their children. All of a sudden they've had a normal life up until this point, and all of a sudden they're given this diagnosis. So what does that mean to them? And I'm going to borrow something from the persistent pain research, which is sort of this biopsychosocial model. So we can look at the biology, we can get those diagnoses, and we can give them a diagnosis. But what does that mean to them from a social point of view? Are they going to be able to carry on with work? Are they able to carry on having a normal family life? And that massive knock-on from their psychological impact, what does it mean to them? What does it make them feel? Does it make them feel less worthy? Does it take things away from them, their self-esteem? So that's really important, and we've got to be able to manage that, and that's quite a difficult thing to be able to manage. So from a sort of a physiotherapy side of things, how do we manage these patients? Well, everything, as we all know it's individualized. So we're looking at the individual, we're looking at what they require and not trying to impose what we think they should do. So we're going to be asking them lots of questions about their life, what they feel they would like to achieve, what they don't want to lose, what they think they're going to lose, all sorts of things like that. From the teenager type, the earlier onset, what they want to do with their life. So big questions about education. Can I go to university? Can I have a normal life? Can I have a family? All those things need to be addressed. Whether that's the consultant, whether that's the physio, whether that's the psychologist, whether that's the clinical nurse specialist, it doesn't matter. If that person with the CMD feels comfortable talking to the physio more so than the consultant, that might be the person they first go to. And then they might not want to talk to the psychologist because the psychologist has that other role. And sometimes it is the physio who gets those awkward questions. So there's some of the things that I find that you're trying to advise people on how to live well, but you're also listening to them, and listening is probably the most important thing we do. So from a practical point of view, I always think we're trying to predict the future. What's it going to be like in 2 years' time, or 3 years' time, or 4 years' time? So we need to be mindful about appropriate referrals onto our respiratory consultants, onto our speech and language consultants, onto our cardiac consultants. And it's asking those questions in clinic about, you know, how they sleep, do they feel refreshed in the morning, any early morning headaches? And if there are, is it a regular thing? And then we will always do FVC, FEV, COVID permitting, you know, and having regular cardiac appointments to make sure their heart is functioning, whether they need pacing, whether they need ICDs, because lots of the conditions have cardiac myopathies and also arrhythmias. And again, giving people giving people that information is a massive psychological burden. So, and again, it's a social burden for them. And it's also referrals on to the more sort of mundane and basic. So wheelchair referrals, as Jenny said, like that point of losing ambulation not only happens in children, it happens in adults. And sometimes that can be more burdensome because all of a sudden their whole life has changed. What does that mean? Now I can't drive, I can't do this, I can't do that. And it's putting those things in place to say, well, you can do them. It's just changed. But that's home adaptations. And we know that home adaptations aren't easy. And then sort of the help in mitigation of loss is through probably the wrong term to use is exercise, but activity. What can we do to promote function? So do we need to look at orthotics to help with ambulation? Do we need to look at a little bit of exercise, hand cycling or leg cycling or hydrotherapy if you can get it? So just trying to keep that, not fitness, but general health. What else? Oh, and just having a really good support structure that can be provided by the MDT, that the person with CMD, whatever variation it is, has someone they know that they can contact. And as Jenny said, I run physio clinics, and I get people phone and I say, I can see you in 2 weeks' time. They haven't got to wait 6 months or 3 months. So we can have that really quick turnaround. We can address their problems and then hopefully alleviate some of their stress and anxieties. So I think that that's the fundamentals of what we do.
Thank you, Nick. That is really interesting, and it's great to get an adult perspective and also the perspective of children transitioning across to adults. And I think you've echoed what the panel here have said about everything having a knock-on effect and using a multidisciplinary approach. And it might be that somebody has a conversation about something and you know you'd need to signpost across or refer across to another service. So that is really helpful. And that sort of leads me on to one of the first questions. We have a lot of calls through the helpline about trying to access services. Now, the COVID pandemic has had a large effect on that. And many of you have spoken about interventions and recognizing when interventions are required. Have things improved now that we're not out of a pandemic as such, but then restrictions have been lifted? So this one's just to everyone really, in terms of how have things changed, or can patients, families do something different to get the access that they need?
I mentioned COVID briefly, then, if I come in on this. I mean, COVID in some ways has challenged the way we do things, and in some ways quite a good thing. Some of the development, for example, to virtual clinics has actually been a helpful thing. And I've had a couple of patients who used to come down from the Western Isles to see me in Glasgow, and they were twins, and it took them forever to get here. And suddenly the development of these were pretty reasonably stable family, and actually the ability to at least mix it up and not necessarily have to pull everyone down if all is well actually is okay. So now there's always a risk if you overly rely on that you're going to miss out earlier the signs. But quite often a lot of these young people might be coming down as part of other things. I mean, I think of the North Star study and things with some Duchenne patients, but other groups as well who are coming down for other assessments. So they are seen, but don't necessarily need to be physically in the room as part of an annual visit to see our team, for example. And there may be other occasions you can catch up with things like sleep studies, or when they're down for other reasons. So there's some aspects of the pandemic which I think we're going to carry on going forward with as a useful thing potentially, because it's hard work for many of these families to get in to sort of come to us. There are some things which I think in many ways COVID affected pediatrics in a very different kind of way to the way it affected adult medicine. And actually, there's been other developments which have kept our services going. Many people, for example, many services have started developing things like home sleep studies in a way which didn't necessarily exist in quite the same way as before. And again, these may be useful things to carry forward. But I think in general, the data, we are starting to go to catch up again. I think we have been careful, I think, not to sort of lose too much, but I think in terms of highlighting problems. But there's no doubt that there has been a consequence for some of these children with neuromuscular disorders. That actually they have not been able to be active to get out, to get to a lot of the therapy sessions that they might have had before, and people have lost function. And I think this is one of the hidden costs of COVID, actually, that people have genuinely taken a step back and potentially not come forward. People have, even if we've had families who we've wanted to bring down for screening, then actually they've been terrified to come into the hospital often as well. So a self-imposed, for very good reason, not accessing these even services that were offered, it has been a challenge. And even just the mindset, I mean, a lot of people will have been advised at the very start of the pandemic to shield. And often in pediatrics, not for very good reasons, actually. I mean, in the sense that we didn't understand it, I suppose, at the beginning. But as evidence came through, they were still on the list who were told to shield, and people became very understandably very anxious. And so actually encouraging people to dare to step out again into the world was a challenge for some people. Obviously, the COVID vaccination has helped many people. But actually, COVID has certainly turned a lot of things upside down. So I think services are starting to roll again. There are perhaps waiting lists. In most cases, I think if we are screening, being proactive enough about things, this probably hasn't made a massive difference, I think, in the longer term. But I think, again, we definitely have to emerge from a time which has shaken everything up for patients in lots of different ways.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. And it sounds like there have been some positives and negatives along the way, and things are changing. And it's positive to know that things are now opening up, services are opening up. And we do find on our helpline and various people contacting us, they are still afraid just to be out in the community around people. And I think it takes a lot of mindset to think, right, I have an appointment, I need to come to this appointment, and these are the reasons why. But I think things are improving, definitely, and things do seem to be moving forward. Jenny, you had your hand up earlier, and then I'll come to Emily.
Okay. Yes, I was just comments again on COVID. So at the beginning, in terms of my team, I had one physio deployed to adult intensive care, redeployed to adult intensive care, and one to paediatric intensive care. So I was left then trying to run the service on my own. We did actually carry on with some face-to-face appointments, but I did some work with NICE about video appointments, about what was acceptable and what wasn't for measurements that we needed for the national database for North Star. And actually trying video appointments were not successful for physios. We could talk about their needs, but as a physio, I naturally need to get my hands on people. And one of the downsides I found is when I would normally do a clinic with a consultant neurologist, a lot of their part can be done by video. So some people have carried on doing them by video and then recognise that they need a physiotherapy assessment and advice and get referred to my clinic. So my waiting list has gone up where it probably shouldn't have done. And then out in the community physiotherapists were redeployed into acute services. So children were not getting the help in the community that they needed. And unfortunately, we have seen children who have lost ambulation, for example, and by the time we've seen them, it's been a little bit too late to intervene. Lots of things have improved, but orthopedic surgery, waiting lists have definitely increased from that point of view. And that has an impact for us if we are advising orthopedic surgery for rehabilitation. One of the other things which I think has been a downside and is starting to improve is that we were only allowed one parent to come in with a child for appointments, which frankly I think has gone on too long. Some of these families were travelling by public transport and then suddenly have to leave one parent outside the hospital to come in, and it also sort of doesn't make sense because they're all in the same household. So and that's something that is improving now, but that's been a bit of a battle, I think. And similarly for patients that have had to come in for respiratory acute infections or whatever else, I think that's been really difficult for parents because they've had to choose which parent is the one that stays, and they've not been allowed to swap over. And that's difficult for the families, but it's actually difficult for the professionals because we're trying to teach, for example, respiratory techniques, and they've only been able to teach one parent, not two. So I think some things have come out of it well, like Phil was saying, some video appointments are good. But I've also seen the other side of it with families saying, oh, can we make it a video one? And I just feel like I'm not doing my job properly to do it that way.
It's been, I think it has been a difficult time. So there are both positives and negatives, definitely. Nick, I will come to you in a second, but I know Emily had her hand up a moment ago. Emily?
Yes, just to partly repeat that kind of patchy pros and cons of COVID. Yeah, I've had a great benefit from being able to do some video calls, but as with Jenny, primarily want to see people face to face. At Great Ormond Street, I think from community services, we felt a push back to the tertiary centres. So there was already quite a patchy service of who would pick up children for the model that we aim to do, as Jenny said, where you would see someone on a kind of a routine MDT review in hospital and then have an expectation that community service would pick up. And we always had areas that could do that more ably than others. And that's become more patchy, with some areas still not going back into seeing children face to face even 2 years in, which can be challenging for children having kind of quite significant communication and swallowing difficulties and not being seen. And the other thing I've seen from kind of both family but education settings is a reluctance to offer school placements, or a reluctance to send children into school. So there's my particular age range of anxiety is the kind of pre-teens, early teens who are hitting 14 now and have hardly been to secondary school and are living, you know, every so often we still come across these children who are living incredibly protected, isolated lives. So a push to make that move of bravery out into the real world, I think we all need to support.
Thank you, Emily. And it's really interesting to hear that it is that age range that you found that are not coming out into the community as much as they should be. Nick, coming to you.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that from the early COVID days, we moved to doing video calls very early, thinking April, May. And actually we found them quite successful, even though doing assessments obviously was extremely limited. We could still offer good advice on management, more so possibly in the adults than the very young, but in teenagers, yes, you could get them to engage, you could get them and give them advice on maintaining that general health whilst they were not in school or not being able to go out. But there was that anxiety, even though things have opened up now, there's still that great anxiety about coming into hospital. And we still have patients who really need to see cardiologists, really need to see respiratory, who go, I'm not coming in because I don't want to get COVID. What I would say is that although we opened up in hospital and we were seeing patients more readily, there was more reluctance from our community colleagues to actually go into people's homes and see them. So that was a bit of a trouble because they wouldn't go into school, they wouldn't go into people's homes, and also the fact that there's an economic burden now that people are feeling, that even the cost of getting to hospital can be a barrier. And I would just go back to Jenny's point about opening up for surgeries. Yes, there's been a massive delay, especially for scoliosis correction in our paediatric patients. The no fault of anyone, but the waiting times are now quite a long time to actually get that surgery done. And that means that they are now spending longer in spinal jackets, which may have an impact on the respiratory function and also their general function. A spinal jacket will help maintain up to a point, but it won't correct, and it won't address the underlying issue, which is they need surgery. Okay,
thank you, Nick. That is really helpful to understand. And there is a question that I do have on spinal jackets, etc., which I'll come to in a moment. But we have actually had a question through the Q&A. It was directed at Emily, but open to all of you if you have any knowledge or experience of it. And this person asked, have you worked with anyone who uses brain AI EEG technology to communicate, and how successful it was?
I mean, I wish I had. This is kind of imagined speech. So having sensors on and people thinking of words and those coming out. I'm not sure whether that's moved beyond an experimental phase yet, but I certainly haven't worked with it. I guess it maybe kind of branches out for me the thought that we know dysarthria, speech sound problems and speech precision can be a real area of difficulty with muscular dystrophies. So like linking with your speech and language therapy team and looking both at kind of direct work to help that, but also, as Jenny kind of described, a wheelchair, the adjunct to support, you know, the physical muscle activity might be an alternative augmentative type of communication. And if you get referred for that, don't be surprised that you'll need to start off doing things that might feel sort of very basic and simplistic, because what you can't do is go in straight at the most high-tech thing until you've checked all capabilities and understood where an individual is and what their needs are with communication. So each area in the UK has an AAC hub run with speech therapists, technical assistants and OTs. So there'll be a process to be referred into that by your speech therapist or paediatrician if that's what you need.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and hopefully that has answered the question. But do get in touch with us if you do need some further information, and we can see what we can do. So just moving back to respiratory management, Phil, a question that was asked was about sleep studies, and you touched on this earlier. So it was, I've been asked to take part in a sleep study. What will happen during this? So it's just the question about what is a sleep study, really.
Yeah, and to some extent that varies depending on where you are and what the actual question they're trying to answer is. I mean, at its most basic, a sleep study is any form of check of your breathing, if you like, during sleep, and that can be as simple as a overnight oximetry reading with a little something on your toe whilst you fall asleep, and that's a lot. That really is quite basic. That's not something I would normally just on of itself do, but you can do those at home. So in that sense, there are also the next level that might be something like an oxygen and carbon dioxide thing, which might be something which we call a Tosca, but there are different technologies out there, which might be a little clip on the ear, for example, that measures again the oxygen, the carbon dioxide levels. And I know that most of my adult colleagues, that's actually the sort of the main thing that we do. And in fact, that is often enough. It answers the question for many people whether they are going to need breathing support. And if your carbon dioxide's okay and your oxygen's all right, and you're not particularly symptomatic, then a simple sleep study like that may be enough. Depends then upon what you have access to locally, really. And the more detailed sleep studies, which perhaps people are being brought into, would also have measures of respiratory effort as well. So yes, they'd measure the gas exchange in terms of the oxygen and carbon dioxide, but often they'll put bands around the chest and bands around the stomach, and also some sensors on the nose to measure airflow. And really what you see perhaps in the sleep study is that you will say, should we say, a degree of underbreathing at nighttime. The bands don't expand quite the same way. And normally the abdominal bands and the chest bands should actually go in and out at the same time. And we can then see whether people start to underbreathe and whether that means there's a change in the flow of air at the nose and then a change in the gas exchange that goes on at those times. If you get really fancy, you can put brainwave tests on as well, but I'm not sure that adds an awful lot. I think most people wouldn't do it for this type of thing. And so really it's a question of those studies can be done increasingly at home. Some centres like doing that. More traditionally, it's done in the hospital. There may be cameras as well to look at sleep. There may be measurements, for example, of microphones to look at snoring, and there's all sorts of bells and whistles you can add around the edge of it. But essentially, it's a measurement of some form of study looking at gas exchange during sleep, making sure that it's good enough, and really then allowing the clinician to make the call along with a conversation around the whole clinical picture with the families and the patients about whether or not this is the moment that breathing support at night time is needed. Sometimes it may be nothing to do with the neuromuscular condition. I've had patients at the age of 10 who perhaps just get normal obstructive sleep apnea, and people might be needing to manage for that, and people then might have a different approach. So it helps with diagnostics, and it helps then just choose that moment when the right time to go in with mask ventilation might be. There's some evidence from a while ago that perhaps going in too early is not the best thing, both in terms of you just don't need it, but potentially might cause more difficulties. But obviously going too late isn't the right thing. So sometimes a sleep study just helps you tease out that right clinical moment to go in, and it can vary in terms of the nature of the question that you're trying to answer.
Thank you, Phil. That's really helpful, and it just emphasises how important it is if you are asked to do a sleep study. So thank you for that. I've got one eye on the time at the moment, so I just want to cover a couple of physiotherapy related questions, and there's one that has come through just now. Jenny, you mentioned something about care in the community. So it isn't always about seeing specialists, but you need to have that available in the community. And I think this is a question that's been asked many times. So it's about access to physiotherapy support through the NHS. So it's not available where these people live, and it's just what is available and how can people get access to relevant therapy. And they say by proper physiotherapists, so I think that's trained to support people with neuromuscular conditions, and that's probably one for you as well, Nick, I think, from an adult perspective.
Well, I think if they have a recognised diagnosis, they should be under a neuromuscular centre, whether that is paediatric or adult. In terms of paediatrics, community provision is generally better than adult provision, I would say, but it's really variable in different areas. Some places give priority to the under fives, some give priority to primary school age. It's really quite variable. I would say if I was seeing somebody at Evelina and I felt that they needed physiotherapy, I could refer them to the local community physiotherapy team. There will always be one, and I can put a case to have it. What I can't do is say how often that child is seen. I can recommend it and I can say what needs to be done, and I can recommend a school visit and a home visit. But what I can't do is say they have to be seen so many times. And that's because their caseload and the way they prioritise is different in every area, unfortunately. And what is consistent, though, is that nobody gets enough. And that is unfortunately something very hard to address. A lot of patients pay for private physiotherapy, and there I would say you need to be really careful. I do some private physiotherapy, and I'm very careful that I only take on children where I understand their condition fully. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. And what I would say is you get the advice from your specialist physiotherapist, who will always contact your NHS physio, but they won't know about the private physio, so you probably need to put them in touch. Something that is going to happen quite soon is Novartis have developed an exercise app called Flexterity, I think it is. And the plan is, so this initially was launched for children with SMA, but the plan is to spread that out amongst other neuromuscular conditions. And the idea would be that the physiotherapist in the specialist centre would put a programme on. The parent can then access that on the app, but then they can share that with their community physiotherapist. And I think that if it takes off, will be really helpful.
Thank you, Jenny. That sounds really exciting, an app where you can get specialist actual physiotherapy online. That does sound amazing, because we have some training modules, but they're actually for healthcare professionals. So if this is for parents and children and adults with conditions, that would make a massive difference.
Yeah,
I think.
it would be an individualized program that they can access.
Yeah, no, that's really, really positive. Nick, just coming to you, do you have anything to add to that?
Only that as Jenny alluded, that the care for adults in the community is far worse than for paediatrics. It's very difficult to get community adult care. We have the luxury where I am that we have the Neuromuscular Centre in Winsford and also the Neuromuscular Centre in Coventry that we can refer patients to, and they both give excellent service. But again, people are willing to travel for an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to those centres once a month, and that's great. The only thing I would say is that from an adult point of view, doing little and often at home on your own with the guidance of the physiotherapist at your neuromuscular specialist centre is probably the best way to go. Seeing private physios, I think it can be very difficult from the understanding of the condition. I think there might be a tendency to actually try and over-exercise people, try and think that they can make people stronger, and that might be a detrimental effect. So it's really difficult to access any form of community physio for adults. That's all I've got to say, really. It's challenging.
Thank you, Nick, for raising that. And yes, it definitely is. We are coming to the end of the session now. So I just wanted to open up to the panel to see if in the last couple of minutes, anyone has anything to add that you feel like we haven't covered in the time we've had. Anna?
Maybe just a final thought is that standards of care are available. There are family guides that can be accessed openly through the Treat and MD website, and MDUK has a lot of fact sheets as well. I think it's very important that families and patients are, they can access this information, and you can really, if there is something that you see that could be offered to you, but you are not accessing, please ask your clinician, ask your therapist, and we're here to help.
Thank you, Anna. And just to reiterate, we as a charity are here to help with our support service and our helpline and our various publications and fact sheets, etc. Anyone else before we come to an end? No. Right, so this is now the end of our session. So I'd like to say thank you to all our panelists and the people who've helped to guide the discussions and the great questions and comments, and also a big thank you to our sponsors. And just a quick reminder that you can see recordings of all the Muscle Matters seminar sessions on our website, and the recording of this session should be posted later this week. We'll be in touch with a really short survey to gather some feedback on the session, which is really invaluable as we now begin to shape our future events. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to all the participants as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a nice
Bye-bye.
day.
Bye.
Bye.